offered sacrificial gifts to the God of his father, Isaac. God spoke there to Israel in visions during the night. Jacob, Jacob, I'm here and listening. I am the true God, the God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt and leave the land I promised you, for I'm going to make you into a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and one day I will be the one to bring you back again. And something else, Joseph's own hands will be the one to close your eyes at the time of your death. Then Jacob got up and continued on from Beersheba toward Egypt. And the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little children, and their wives in the wagons that Pharaoh sent with them. They also brought their livestock and the goods they had acquired in the land of Canaan. And at last, Jacob and his family arrived in Egypt. His sons, his grandsons, his daughters, and his granddaughters, all of his descendants came with him to Egypt.
Here are the names of the descendants of Israel. That is Jacob and his family who settled in Egypt. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn son, and his sons, Hanok, Palu, Hezron, and Carmi. Simeon and his sons, Jemuel, Jamin, Ohad, Jachin, Zohar, and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. Levi and his sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Judah and his sons, and Onan, who both died in the land of Canaan. Shelah, Perez, and Zerah. Perez and his sons, Judah's grandchildren, Hezron and Hamul. Issachar and his sons, Tola, Hubah, Iob, and Shimron. Zebulun and his sons, Sered, Elon, and Jaleel. These sons, along with his daughter Dinah, are the 33 sons and daughters born to Jacob by Leah in Padan Aram. Gad and his sons, Ziphion, Haggai, Shuni, Ezbon, Eri, Arodi, and Areli. Asher and his sons, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, Beriah, and their sister, Sarah. Beriah and his sons, Gad's grandchildren, Heber and Malchiel. These are the 16 children born to Jacob by Zilpah. And Zilpah was the servant that Laban gave to his daughter Leah when she married Jacob. Jacob's sons by Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph had Manasseh and Ephraim in the land of Egypt with his wife Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Benjamin and his sons, Bela, Becher, Ashbel, Gera, Naaman, Ehi, Rosh, Muppim, Huppim, and Ard. These are the 14 children born to Jacob by Rachel. Dan had only one son, Hushim. Naphtali and his sons, Jaziel, Guni, Jazer, and Shalem. These are the 7 children born to Jacob by Bilhah. Bilhah was the servant Laban gave to his daughter Rachel when she married Jacob. So all of Jacob's children and grandchildren who came to Egypt, those who were in some way his offspring, but not the wives of his sons, were 66 in all. Joseph had 2 sons who were born in Egypt. All of the people directly related to Jacob who now lived in Egypt numbered 70 people. Now, Israel decided to send Judah ahead to Joseph in order to learn the way to Goshen. When they came to the land of Goshen, they stopped. Joseph got into his chariot and went out to meet his father Israel. When he saw him, he fell on his neck and wept for a long time. Jacob said to Joseph, "I can now die in peace, because I've seen your face, and I know that you are alive." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, God.
Why do we worship? Why do we worship? That was a question that at my previous church, the worship pastor there, he would always ask the praise teams, the musicians, the vocalists, anybody who was involved with being on stage during Sunday morning service, he would ask that question, why do we worship? Now the reason he would ask that question is very simple. If you don't know why you're doing something, then you'll never know when you accomplish it. If you don't know what your goals, your objectives are in doing something, you'll never know when you've done it. So the question is, what is worship? Why do we do it? Richard Foster, in his book Celebration of Discipline, and if you've never read this book, or if you've never read anything by Richard Foster, I highly encourage it. Richard Foster, in Celebration of Discipline, on his chapter on the discipline of worship, says this, and if you'll just oblige me here. He says, to worship is to experience reality, to touch life. It is to know, to feel, to experience the resurrected Christ in the midst of the gathered community. It's a breaking into the Shekinah of God, or better yet, being invaded by the Shekinah of God. Shekinah means the glory or the radiance of God dwelling in the midst of His people. Worship is our response to the overtures of love from the heart of the Father. Its central reality is found in spirit and truth. It's kindled within us only when the Spirit of God touches our human spirit. Forms and rituals do not produce worship, nor does the disuse of forms and rituals. We can use all the right techniques and methods. We can have the best possible liturgy, but we have not worshiped the Lord until spirit touches spirit. The words of the chorus, "Set my spirit free that I may worship thee," reveal the basis of worship. Until God touches and frees our spirit, we cannot enter this realm. Singing, praying, and praising all may lead to worship, but worship is more than any of them. Our spirit must be ignited by the divine fire. Worship is a pause before God, before we rush through the rest of our lives. Worship is a pause before God, before we rush through the rest of our lives. Today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 46, so if you have a Bible, I encourage you to go there. Genesis chapter 46. And Genesis 46 starts off in verse 1 like this. It says, "So Israel set out with all that was his." So Israel set out with all that was his. Now, everybody say Israel. Israel. And when you say Israel, automatically most of us think of the country, right? The nation of Israel, the people of Israel. But before there was a nation, before there was a country, before there was all the turmoil in the Middle East, there was one man who got a name change. His name way back when was Jacob. Everybody say Jacob. Jacob. And Jacob got a new name from God, and that name was Israel. Say Israel. 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 It means you've struggled, you've worked through something. It became his namesake, a new identity given to him by God. Now, Israel had a big family, you know this. Lots and lots of kids. And he just got some big news. If you were here last week, he just got some really big news. See, Joseph had some favorite sons. I know those don't exist today, but he had some favorite sons. One of his favorites, and probably the favorite, was a man by the name of Joseph. Everybody say Joseph. Joseph. Just making sure you're awake. Joseph. Yeah. Joseph had kind of a rough lot in life. One could say that he was handed lemons all throughout his life. Notice the pants are very clean. Joseph, the people who haven't been here during that Sunday are like, what's that got to do with anything? Just ask your neighbor. Joseph had a rough lot in life. He was sold into slavery, then he got falsely accused, thrown in prison, and finally he gets a second chance, he gets released, and he gets promoted to the second of all people in Egypt. He gets basically the king's rights. And so he governs all the people of Egypt during a tough time. And so Joseph in Egypt, even though he's an outsider, he's seen as a hero because he has saved the people of Egypt from hunger during a terrible famine. Now, Joseph had this rough life, but it was sort of forced on him, if you remember. His brothers were the ones that kicked him to the side, who didn't like him, didn't like the way that he talked, didn't like the way that he conducted himself. He was way too churchy for them, and so they're the ones who sold him into slavery. You might remember Joseph had a couple dreams. Not dreams, Joseph? Yes? Okay. Yeah. Joseph dreamed a lot, and that was how he communicated with God. And his brothers thought that was crazy, so they sold him away for some silver. There comes a time during this famine that the brothers need some food. They go to Egypt, and lo and behold, Joseph is there. Joseph, the brother that 20, 30 years before they had sold into slavery, he's there with a whole lot of power and a whole lot of armies behind him. And they're terrified, but he says, don't worry about it. God was just working way ahead of all of us. He had this under control. Go get Dad. So the brothers, they rush back home, a 300-mile journey. They rush back home and they say, Dad, Dad, Jacob, Israel, whatever your name is today, listen. Joseph is alive. I know we told you all those years ago that he was dead. And we brought you that coat of his. You remember the coat? And it was all shredded and covered in blood. Look, that was all just a ruse. It was fake. He's not really dead. He's alive, and he wants us all to move to Egypt. See all the Egyptian carts and all these wagons that the Pharaoh gave us? See, this is proof. Come to Egypt. And so Jacob, Israel, sets out with all that was his. And it says that he stops at a place named Beersheba. Everybody say Beersheba. Beersheba. Say it one more time. Beersheba. Beersheba. Beersheba, right. He comes to Beersheba and he stops. Yeah. Beersheba is the last stop before you get into Egypt. Beersheba is the southernmost place, the southernmost location in the Promised Land. It's sort of like those signs that you see, last rest stop for 57 miles. Jacob stops at Beersheba and he worships. It says he builds an altar. There's something special about Beersheba. Beersheba meant something to Jacob and to his family. See, if you think back several months, there was a man by the name of Abraham. Everybody say Abraham. Abraham. And Abraham once had to strike this deal, this treaty, with a king named Abimelech. Some people are like, oh. He strikes this treaty with Abimelech that they will have peace, and they dig this well, and they name the place Beersheba, or the place of 7 oaths. Abraham and Abimelech. This was the place that Hagar fled to whenever she was scared for her life. Hagar was the Egyptian maidservant of Abraham. Do you remember this? And she was scared to death because her master's wife, Sarah, didn't like her. So she ran out to the wilderness, scared to death, and God said, don't worry. Go back home. It'll be okay. Beersheba was the place that Abraham dug a well, and he planted a tamarisk tree. Tamarisk trees grow really well there because they don't need much water and they have deep roots. Beersheba was the place that Abraham came back to, and he worshipped after he took his son Isaac up Mount Moriah. You remember that story? Where he thanked God for providing. Beersheba was the place that God appeared to Isaac, Abraham's son, and said, do not be afraid. Do you have a place to pause? Do you have a special place that you go to be with God? This past weekend, I was, like I said, at the Kiara Center, and I didn't know what to expect. My professor had said, you're going to a retreat center, it's ran by nuns. Some people thought it was going to be like Sister Act. right? You're going to have this little concrete room with a tiny little window. But it turned out to be an incredible, beautiful experience. High class. It was funny. We got to walk around the campus, and we walked into the church, St. Francis of Assisi Church. We walk in, and the church is enormous. And by enormous, I don't mean enormous. I mean you could fit several of our churches in it. It was big. It was grand. It was vertical. It drew your eyes up. When you walked into this church, you dare not speak. Because there was just something about it that overwhelmed you. Do you have places like that where you can meet God? Maybe for you it's this place, this church. A place that has been covered in prayer, a place that carries with it many memories. Maybe for you it's in your car on the way to or from work. A place where you can finally turn the radio down, you can make things quiet. Find a place that you can pause, a place that is quiet, a place that is easily accessible. Alaska might be beautiful, but it's hard to go there all the time. Pick a place that's free from distraction. A place where you can listen to God. Find a place to pause. At night, God spoke to him in a vision. Now, this isn't unusual for Jacob, right? This is fairly common. See, Jacob had this sort of connection with God at night. But he had a specific time that it seemed like that was when he and God had free schedules and they were able to reconnect. You remember Jacob way back when he was fleeing from his brother Esau. Everybody say Esau. Esau. He was fleeing from his brother Esau, and he stopped at a place and he laid down, and he had this vision of angels going up and down, a staircase to heaven, just going up and down and up and down. He had this vision. He had another vision another time where he was laying down, preparing to meet his brother Esau after being gone for many years, scared to death, and he had this vision, this experience where he wrestled with a man all night long. That's where he got his new name. See, for Jacob, for Israel, the night time was the perfect time for God to speak to him. It's when Jacob's clever, mischievous, witty little mind could shut off and God could get a word in edgewise. And so God, he speaks to Jacob in this vision, and he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Do you have a time that you pause? In a world that is constantly working on being more and more productive, more and more efficient, more and more full, do you have time to pause? And I don't just mean an hour on Sunday morning. My professor, it's no secret, so I think I'm free to tell it, says that every morning he wakes up early, before his wife is awake. He gets himself a cup of coffee because he needs that. He goes down into the living room area of his house. He says, he quietly sings and he dances before God. This is a 50, 60-year-old man. He prays, he reads his Bible, He just carves out a little bit of time where he can be with God. And it doesn't have to be a big, long, multi-hour session. Just a few minutes that you can pause and listen. Maybe it's not in the morning. Maybe you're not a morning person. I know I'm not. Maybe for you it's in the afternoon. Afternoons are usually good for me. The office is empty. I usually sing a little bit in my office because the office is empty. I can be as loud as I want. I get opportunity to read when my schedule is a little bit freer. Maybe for you it's at night, right before you go to bed. The last thing that you want on your mind is your Heavenly Father. Wherever it is for you, find a time, a consistent time. A time away from distractions. A time where you're not rushed. That you can pause to be with God. And so God tells Jacob, do not be afraid. And we think, well, what's he got to be afraid of? He just got really good news. He can save a bunch of money on his car insurance by switching to God. He got really good news that his son was alive. What's there to be afraid of? Well, there are several things. For one, it's a long trip for an old guy. It is. You got to remember, we aren't flying here. We aren't sitting in a car for a couple hours. He has to walk it. Or maybe ride on a camel. 300 miles. He's old. And several times Jacob has said, I'm just going to die. I'm just going to go down to the grave. And so he doesn't even know if he's going to make it to Egypt. And that's another thing. This isn't just, running down to the old synagogue. This isn't going down to Dad's well. This is Egypt. Those of you who have been here all year long, going through this journey through Genesis, you know Egypt is a bad place to go, right? Jacob hears the stories of his grandpa Abraham and the time that he went to Egypt, and it messed up a whole lot of things. He lost a cousin, Lot, who ended up going a different direction. There was that whole mess with Hagar. There was these difficult relations. He remembers the stories of his dad, Isaac, who started to go to Egypt, and God says, don't go to Egypt. Go the other way. Don't even look at Egypt. Egypt is bad. And so now, Jacob has his boys come, and they say, Dad, we got to go to Egypt. And Joseph is there. This is where we got to go. And up to this point, Jacob hasn't heard from God yet. And so he's a little nervous. Sure you got to go to Egypt? He stops at the last place before crossing into Egyptian territory. And he says, I'm kind of nervous about this. Egypt? And God says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Somebody said that there are 365 occurrences of the phrase, do not be afraid, one for every day of the year. I don't know if that's true or not, I haven't counted. But I know that there are a lot of them. It's a very common commandment of God, do not be afraid. He says you're going to make it to Egypt, don't worry about that. I want you to go. And then, notice what he says in Genesis chapter 46. He says, do not be afraid to go to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you. That great nation, that's what Jacob was listening for. Remember, God had told Abraham a couple times, Abe, I want you to leave your dad's household. I'm going to make you into a great nation. Abraham went a couple years later. Abraham, I know you don't have any kids yet. Don't worry, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Okay. Isaac, look, I know times are tough right now, but I'm going to make you into a great nation. listening for that phrase. That's the key term. Okay, God, this is still in your plan. And we've come quite a ways. There's 70 of us now. It's a big family reunion. Almost as big as the Williams family. And so he says, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Just go. Have you ever had something big on the horizon? Something scary? Something kind of unnerving coming up? Maybe it's a medical thing. Maybe you've got health issues. Maybe it's a job change. Maybe it's some family issues that you know are going to come to a head. Maybe it's a funeral that's coming up. Maybe it's a birth. It's just something big on the horizon. Some big change, some life-altering thing is coming. And you need to pause. You need to stop before you rush into all the stress and the mess and all the confusion and the questions, and you need to pause so that you can hear from God. And God tells Jacob, do not be afraid. I'll make you into a great nation in Egypt. I'll go there with you. And notice what he says. Genesis 46. He says, verse 4, I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. I know this is the promised land, Jacob. Don't worry. This is just a side detour. I'll bring you back again. And you're going to make it to your son, and he's the one who will lay you to rest when you finally die. If you fast forward to the end of Genesis, which will be there in a couple weeks, Joseph, after Jacob dies, he orders Jacob's bones to be returned to the land of Canaan. Fast forward a little bit more, and the rest of Jacob's family has grown exponentially, and they leave Egypt in a great exodus, and they make their way back to the Promised Land. Fast forward quite a ways after that, and the Messiah that had been promised for decades, for centuries, flees to Egypt, only to return a few years later. God says, I'll go with you and I will bring you back. Sometimes we need that assurance that we're stepping into something big, but it's okay. So Jacob wakes up from his dream, and he heads out with his family, all of them. And if the numbers seem a little funky, I can explain that to you later, okay? It does work out, I promise. 70 people, not counting the wives, head off and make it to Egypt. And then there's this whole big long list of funny-looking names. And we've gone through lists of funny-looking names before. And if you're like me, or like if you're like most people, you see the big long list and you go, okay, all right, moving on. Where's the important stuff? Well, you just skipped it. See, the thing is, there's a reason that the author of Genesis pauses to recognize these names. Everybody look to your left. Now everybody look to your right. None of the people that you just saw will probably ever be an Abraham, a Moses, a Peter, a Paul, a Joshua, a Jacob. But instead, they might be an Ard. They might be a Moen. And yet, God values each one of their stories. Every life, every name, every face is a component to his grander story. It helps to flesh out, to fill out the story that God is telling throughout the history of humanity. They're important to God, and so they should be important to us. And that's why the author pauses to notice the people around him. Joshua is not in this story. But Jacob is. And Jacob's reunited with his family, with Joseph, and he cries and he weeps, and there's this beautiful moment where they're finally reconnected after 20, 30 years. Why do we worship? Why do we worship? It's not to highlight our singing abilities. It's not to echo the creeds and the doctrines and the liturgies of our spiritual forefathers. It's not even to appear holier to the people around us. The reason we worship is to pause before God, before we rush into the rest of our lives. It's to recognize the greatness of our Creator. It's to admit to our own failures, our own weaknesses, our own shortcomings. It's to thank Him for everything that He's given us. And whether it's something big, whether it's something small. It's to ask for help. To ask for the things that we need. I know life is busy. I know there are a lot of things that can distract us, a lot of things that can get in the way. But God asks that we pause. So that we can be with Him. Today, may you find a time and a place to pause before God. May you pause to really, truly see the people and the stories around you. And may you pause to worship the God who loves you. Let's pray. Father, we take just a moment to stop what we're doing. Pause before you. There's something about being in your presence that overwhelms us. Something about being in your presence that revives us. Father, today, may we set out to create space and time to meet with you on a consistent basis. Not because you tell us to, but because we need it. Each one of us has something big on the horizon coming, something that we're not really looking forward to. And we're scared and we're nervous and we don't know how it's going to turn out, and we need our Dad. So let us pause. Let us worship you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.